So welcome to Unschooling Conversations. Today I am joined by Gina Riley, and in this episode we are going to talk about unschooling, exploring learning beyond the classroom. So I'm Heidi Steel. I'm a former teacher and an unschooling parent to 4 school-aged children who are happy living and learning as they go. You can find out more about me and the support that I give to unschooling families, mostly on Facebook at Live, Play, Learn, but also on the website liveplaylearn.org. Today I'm joined by Gina Riley. We're going to have an unschooling conversation on exploring learning beyond the classroom, which happens to be the title of her book. So welcome, Gina.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Would you like to introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about your book?
Sure. So again, my name is Dr. Gina Riley. I am an academic first and foremost. I am a clinical professor of adolescent special education at CUNY Hunter College. I coordinate the adolescent special education program there. I am a researcher. I've researched topics in homeschooling and unschooling and intrinsic motivation for over 20 years now. Probably best known for my research on unschoolers with Dr. Peter Gray. And I am an author, which is so cool. I have written the research-based book. It's actually the first academic book on unschooling called Unschooling, Exploring Learning Beyond the Classroom. And I am the mother of an adult son who unschooled his way through. And so his first day of school was the first day of college.
Wow. So he really went all the way through, right up until he got to college before he went and joined sort of a mainstream academic world.
Yeah.
Cool.
He had never stepped into a traditional classroom before that first day of college.
Do you think that changed the experience for him?
Probably made it more serious a little bit. I think obviously when you transition to college, there's all sorts of different transitions that people go through. And I think he went through some different transitions that maybe traditionally schooled kids don't go through, right? So traditionally schooled kids might really know, if there's a lecture at 3:30, you get there at 3:30. Traditionally school kids will just, take notes for the test and things like that. So there's some stereotypical things. And then he really had to learn that going to college, right? Like a 3:30 class meant 3:30. It didn't mean 3:35. And when you take notes, in a lecture, you can't just take notes at what you're interested in. You actually have to really key in if there's an exam, what's on the exam and things like that. So he'll talk about his journey in that way, that yes, he had an adjustment and yes, he had some transition, but that transition wasn't big. It actually is pretty small because he always was learning through life and he always liked learning. And so college was sort of a natural step for him.
Yeah, and like you say, if college is a big step really for everyone. It changes gears for a lot of students, doesn't it? So they all have their own new things to learn and adjust to when they go there.
Yeah, it was really interesting to watch, and it's also really cool, right? He's an academic. He really likes the academic environment, and there's a history there. I was a academic throughout his childhood. He came to a lot of my college classes. I was a single mom unschooling him, so there was no person taking care of him except for me. So he came to academia and college classes a lot while he was growing up. So it's sort of like he lived that life and then he entered that life. So that became less of a transition there too.
Yeah, so in the introduction of your book, you actually tell us that you were a single parent in your mid-20s, and you were also studying when you decided that you were going to unschool your son. And I wondered whether it was something that you would actually recommend to folk in like a similar situation. Is that something that you found really worked for you and your son? Was it something you would do again?
So yes, for myself, I would absolutely make the choice again. The time unschooling was such a precious time for both of us. You do have to understand that I really work in two worlds, right? So I am a teacher of New York City public school teachers, a professor there, and I am also this person who unschooled their child as a single mom. And so I realize that everyone's situations are different, that everyone has different, ideas ideas for their kid. And so obviously I respect all choices, but if you are a parent and you have decided that you want to enjoy this path of unschooling and you are a single parent, I mean, is it something I would recommend? If you can do it, go for it, because it really does. It creates such precious memories. And it's nice to be able to live beside your child and learn along with them. So yes, I would definitely make that decision again. I wouldn't trade those times for the world. However, it was a balancing act, right? I was working, I was going to school, I was trying to make a living, and I was raising my child and homeschooling or unschooling my child. So people ask how I did it. I will answer, I don't know, right? It was just a decision we made every day and then every year. But I will say it was one of the most beautiful decisions I've probably ever made in my life.
That really resonates with me, because I've got 4 children and people ask me the same thing, like, how do you do it? And I don't really know how I do it. We just do one day at a time. And especially initially, we were like, well, this is the decision we're making for today. This is what we will do today. And we can review it. You know, it doesn't have to be like a one-time thing. You know, if it's not working out or something needs tweaking or changing, then that's what we will do. And then here we are. Personally, sort of, I would say we're in the middle of our journey, you know, 10 years down the line, and I continue to say, yes, I'm pleased that we've made this decision. So what led you to that decision? What was it that led you to that decision?
Yeah, so there are different paths here, right? And so I was involved in the Leche League, and I have to say, the Leche League and the attachment parenting philosophy did play into this decision. At the time, I was also studying for my bachelor's and then my master's degree. And I always tell this story. I was thinking about a master's degree topic, and I'm thinking about my thesis, and I'm like, what am I going to do my thesis on? And I read this article, it was early 2000s. It was actually the year 2000 in the New York Times magazine, about these 2 researchers, Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, who are studying intrinsic motivation. And like, suddenly I'm just like, oh my gosh, yes, this is what I want to write my thesis on. And I ended up writing a thesis on intrinsic motivation in homeschoolers in the year 2000. This is what I want to live my life with, right? Living life based on passion and strengths and interests. And this is really what I want my child's education and life to look like. So yes, it was spurred on by a specific parenting philosophy, but it was also spurred on by like the whole concept of intrinsic motivation and self-determination, which ended up being a research interest and something I write about for years and years.
Fabulous. So at the weekend, I actually held a webinar on self-determination theory.
I did see that.
Yeah, so with Naomi Fisher, who I know you have met, and you are cited in her book. So yeah, so we talked all about motivation and self-determination theory, and it was brilliant. So in your own words, could you describe a little bit about what intrinsic motivation means and how that relates to unschooling and the education that we are providing for our children?
Sure. So intrinsic motivation, according to Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, is all about living through passion, strengths, and interests, right? So you want to do something, you go ahead and do it. There's no extrinsic or external motivating factor behind it. You just want to do it. It's like living the best ever Saturday, I think someone had said, and it's a beautiful description of what intrinsic motivation is. Within intrinsic motivation, I specifically study cognitive evaluation theory. So that's a sub-theory of self-determination theory. And cognitive evaluation theory will lay out the 3 environmental factors or tenets that enhance intrinsic motivation. And of course, you have to facilitate it, right? You can't force these tenets on others. So I talk about this all the time. The first one is a sense of competence, right? Our kids, while in any learning environment, need to have a sense of competence, a sense of knowledge of their strengths, a sense of knowing that they can do things. And then they need to have a sense of autonomy, a sense of choice and freedom. And that choice and freedom comes so naturally within the realm of homeschooling and unschooling, which of course you know. And then there's this element of a sense of relatedness, a sense of unconditional acceptance, a sense that someone has your back as a kid no matter what, right? And so I took these three things, and again, my research has always for 20 something years centered on this, cognitive evaluation theory and its relationship to homeschooling and unschooling and other forms of self-directed learning. And I really think that that theory fits so beautifully into this type of education. And so whenever I talk about homeschooling or unschooling, I'm always coming from the perspective of self-determination theory and cognitive evaluation theory.
Yeah, I think it's actually really, like you say, it fits so naturally. It's really hard not to see that that's what's happening, that our children are just, intrinsically motivated. They follow their own passions and they follow their own interests and they ask their own questions and they make their own choices, and that we become the facilitators of that. There's not actually anything we can set out, like a program or an assignment or a curriculum we can set out to teach them that. They actually have that ability innately, and that we just create this environment where that is sustained and encouraged and given the opportunity to grow and flourish.
I'll say to my teachers, right, when I teach, like, that sounds so simple, right? You give kids competence and you give kids a sense of autonomy and you give kids sense of relatedness. But that, when you go out and you pan this out in the real world, I mean, that's the hard work of doing this, right? That's the hard work of unschooling. That's the hard work of teaching. And so it really, it sounds easy, and it's just the application of it that gets a little rougher, right? But once you apply it, it becomes this really beautifully laid out theory that, again, equates beautifully to the realm of unschooling and self-directed learning.
I think people really want like a how-to manual, like what do I
Sure.
actually do? And
Yeah.
it doesn't really look like that, because there isn't a, this is how you set up your, house or this activity, and it doesn't really work like that. So that's where the application becomes a little bit maybe complicated or a little bit uneasy, because people can't quite grasp what they actually have to physically do. Because like you say, the relatedness part is about them being unconditionally loved, and that doesn't really come with a manual. That's just how a child feels, and that again could be different for any particular child. One of my children might like me to spend oodles and oodles of time with them, and that gives them the message that they are loved and loved and loved. And another one of my children just wants me to meet their physical needs and be available when they want me to interact with them, or when they want to interact with me, maybe that way around. So it's not as simple as having a manual that says do these things and you will succeed.
Yeah.
So you must have worked with or met, I'm guessing, a lot of unschooling families. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I wonder whether you have ever managed to come up with a definition of unschooling. It's a bit of a red herring, that one, isn't it?
So I think the definition that Peter Gray and I came up with, right, is housed in our 2013 study of unschooling families. And we did a large scale study of unschooling families, 232 families. And it was the grounding study, right, of unschoolers. So when you talk about the definition, again, you talk about living through life, you talk about living without assessments, learning through strengths and interests and passions. So there's all sorts of things that go into that definition. But if your audience is researchers and looking for a definition, it is within that study. That's the definition now most people will use.
So the title of your book is Learning Beyond the Classroom. So what does learning look like beyond the classroom? What is your experience of children who learn outside of school?
Yeah, I think everyone has this myth, right, that homeschooling is within the home. I think it's a great stereotype. I think it's something a lot of outsiders to homeschooling feel, that everyone homeschools within the home. And most homeschoolers will tell you that no, that's not really how we do it, right? It's a lot of learning through life, learning through community, learning through my neighborhood, learning through different activities and things that we do each day. And that's really the premise of unschooling, right? The premise is you do where interests take you. And so when you're talking about exploring the world beyond the classroom, it's really exploring the world, right? Beyond the home, beyond that internal environment, out into the external environment. I'll say always that unschooling really gives us a blueprint for what generalization of learning looks like, right? So in schools, they do a very like, you create a lesson plan and then you'll teach the lesson. And then you'll talk a little bit about how the lesson can be generalized to the real world. And in unschooling, it's really backwards. It's backwards planning. You do the thing out in the real world, and then you're like, oh, this is really interesting. And so you learn all those little things you needed to do the thing out in the real world better. So I'll give you an example from my son's life when he was little. My son loved rocks, right? He would go in the backyard and pick out a rock and want to know like what this looks like. So we spent a good chunk of age 4 to probably age 8 or 9 at the Natural History Museum or outside or at nature centers looking for all these different rocks, figuring out the type of rock. As my son grew in this so-called hobby, right, which is really science, he ended up wanting to know more about things like the periodic table or about how elements go together. And so if you want to know how elements go together, you've got to know a little bit of math. And so here comes the study of the periodic table, and here comes the study of math that he really did on his own. And again, through the external interest. So it's really a nice, very innovative way to look at education, right? You do the thing, and then you learn about all the components that align with the thing.
Yeah, I love that idea of it being sort of topsy-turvy. So as an ex-teacher, my specialism was early years, and a lot of the study that I did and my personal pathway into unschooling was in child development and how children naturally learn, and how they play and how to support their play, and it's a very sort of bottom up model. You're starting with the children where they are, and then helping them to develop and grow up into adulthood. A lot of the curriculum that is used in schools is actually top down. So they start with, what do I want this child to know at A level, right? So for them to know that, they need to know this in their exams 2 years before at GCSE. For them to know this, they need to know, they sort of take it from the top and they break it down further and further until they get to, year 1. And they say, right, in year 1, the child needs to know, A, B, and C. But unschooling is very different to that, in that it turns that upside down and puts it the other way around. Says, actually, we're going to start with the child, start with what they're interested in, and we're going to grow in knowledge and competence, from there on upwards. So it's very similar to what you were just describing there.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting to me how that works.
Yeah. So you just mentioned your son there and his interest in rocks. I have a son who's currently 13, and he used to have a real interest in rocks as well. His was initiated by playing Minecraft, which he still plays now, and so we're 8 years later into our Minecraft journey. But it looks very different now. But initially it was all about the rocks, and we did very similar actually to what you were saying. We went to the Natural History Museum, and we live on the edge of the South Downs in the southeast of England, and that's all quite chalk based. So we'd go and look in great big chalk pits and just spend days playing in chalk pits, really. and exploring things that way. And we bought him a rock collection, which we got off of eBay. In fact, actually, I think one of them was a rock collection that sort of did the home ed circuit in our local community, just a collection that got passed around, which was brilliant and useful.
Yeah.
But I wonder whether you are able, because your son's an adult now, whether you are able to, on hindsight, look back and see a thread through the things that he was interested in as a child and how that links sort of together into who he is now and what he's pursuing now. Is that it just really fascinates me because
no, the answer is no. but it's so funny how this works, right? And I think that this actually is helpful to unschooling parents. It's like the myth of the unschooled genius. They gain this interest and then they go on and on. They become this famous geologist, right? And like, that's a wonderful, wonderful dream. But that's sometimes and frequently not how it works, right? So what did tie together is the notion of intrinsic interest and the notion of being able to learn what you need to learn. So he spent, he really did spend a bunch of years on geology, loved that, and then got really into golf, which has no relationship to geology whatsoever. But it was his love. And through it, again, he learned yardages and he learned math and he learned angles. And there was all sorts of things that you would never think of when you see this kid playing golf that he learned through golf. It also was worrisome to me, right? Because all of a sudden golf becomes this very non-academic interest. At least I could play with geology, right? Which is very STEM based and science based. Golf is this real, it's a sport. But he spent years really perfecting this game of golf, which I thought was interesting. He was in tournaments and stuff like that. So years and years on golf. And then it became bowling. And so again, non-academic interest, right? So here we are, unschooling parent and son doing all these non-academic things. Was I worried a little? Sure, right? But this is where his interest led. And then it was after bowling, then interestingly, so he's really into bowling, he's really into sports, he's really into golf. We spent a year on video games, right? He got very, very good at the Nintendo Wii. And of course, just like any unschooling parent, right, in the back of your head, you're just like, oh my gosh, like what's going to happen here? But it's about love and trust. So I'm just going with the flow at this point. And interestingly, I took a guitar lesson just for fun. A student of mine had given me as a gift one of his older guitars. And I took a guitar lesson and I started like playing guitar very, very, beginner-like. And my 13-year-old son looked at me and he said, I want to learn that. Teach me that. And I told him, like, I don't know how, right? I don't know how to teach you this because I'm still learning myself. So I don't mind, paying for lessons. And at the time that was financially impactful, but I didn't, again, if I'm going to spend money on anything, I'm going to spend money on my kids' interests. And he was like, nah, I don't want a lesson, right? I just want to learn it. But he did. He took up the offer of the lesson because I said, listen, you could take like a month's worth of lessons. You like it, you stay. You don't like it, you leave, right? That's like totally your choice. And he tells this story. He ends up really liking it and really loving it. And that love kind of went on throughout, like, I guess what you would call high school years. He, in New York State, we ended like the high school curriculum at 16 or whatever we were supposed to do for that high school curriculum. And so he enrolled in a guitar certificate program at Berklee College of Music in Boston, Massachusetts. And at the time it was online. And so through that, he gained so many new skills in terms of music and theory and guitar, but also an entrance to the world of college and online education and what that looked like. And that led him to then apply to college as a classical guitar major. He ended up getting his bachelor's in music performance with a 3.97 or some crazy GPA, and then going on to now he's writing his thesis for his master's in music theory. He's also a writer and he owns his own music education business, which is interestingly, a lot of homeschoolers take lessons from him. And so, you see this trajectory, and looking back, you see that all these interests just led to this interest that stayed with him. But you also see that it wasn't linear. It wasn't like this kid loved music all his life and then became this amazing musician, right? He had the skills of wanting to learn, the intrinsic motivation piece. He had the love of this thing and knowing how to love whatever thing he was interested in. And he took it from there. So, I mean, the answer is, do you see the woven thing turning into this beautiful blanket? Sure, but the trajectory is different, and not all interests turn to career right away. And they might like open themselves up in different ways and at different times in life.
Yeah, I love that idea that he just had the confidence to, even though it seemingly changed direction completely, it's just that following that love of learning, and he had the confidence that it doesn't matter what I'm interested in, that I can take that and I can do with that.
Yeah, and even like, so he's a writer now, and he's publishes a lot about his experience homeschooling and unschooling. And I will say, did I see like inklings of that at 6th grade? No, he hated writing. He refused to write. His handwriting was atrocious, right? So, for unschooling parents who are like, what do I do with this, right? You just wait it out and you watch, right? And that's what you do.
See, that's what I was going to ask you. I was going to say, because you mentioned during the course of this, his golf period of time, passion, and the bowling phase that you mentioned, that you were secretly sort of hanging on and thinking, where is this going, and what's going on? Like, what thought processes did you go through during those periods that made you decide that I'm gonna keep on this path, we're going to keep unschooling, I'm not going to pull the plug and say that's it, this isn't working? What was it that kept you focused on this path?
I mean, I'm going to be honest with you, right? I was a young single mom for pretty much half the time we were unschooling, and I was scared. I didn't want anyone to report us if my son was playing golf all day, or, like if his goal was to score a 300 in a bowling game. But every day, there are little like threads or little things where you say, wow, like he's really learning this, or look how cool it is to be able to watch him do this, or how interesting. And those little threads became bigger, right? Like it's these little moments in unschooling that keep you unschooling. Did I go to sleep at night? This was a big educational experiment, as my mother, who was a middle school guidance counselor, will say. And I didn't know what was going to happen from one day to the next. But we're all not promised this specific path, right? Even if you send your kid to public school, you're not promised this ideal journey. And so every journey goes through ebbs and flows. And I think it's important for unschooling parents to take that into context. As long as you're providing a space full of competence, and a space where kids know their strengths, and a space of choice and freedom, and a space of unconditional acceptance, right? I like you and love you no matter what, whether you choose golf or bowling or geology, or, become a pro at music theory. I love you through all of it. What greater a gift can you give a child, right, than that space to sort of explore who you are, to really get to know you? And I will say, like, as a almost 25-year-old human being, he's a great, great person, right? So not only is he super smart and super amazing and a hard worker, and he really is, he's the hardest worker I know, he's also a good person. And at the end, I knew that that was all I wanted. I just wanted my kid to grow up to be a good person. I didn't care if that good person was a sanitation worker or a doctor. I just wanted the kid to grow up a good person. And he did, and I'm really proud of that. But again, it could have gone a whole other way, and I don't want to dismiss that either.
Yeah, I mean, I love what you were saying there about whatever our choices are for our children, there is no easy path. If we send our children to mainstream school, or whether we choose to you know, home educate and use a curriculum and structure, or whether we're autonomous and we unschool, whatever we are, however we are helping our children to grow into adults, you know, there are always going to be challenges, because we're dealing with small human beings and we're dealing with life. You know, no one is really exempt from the tricky moments of life. There isn't really an easy path, whichever path you choose to take. But I wonder, when you're talking about sort of grown unschoolers, sort of in your research and your contact with grown unschoolers, is there anyone that you've met that has regretted their unschooling journey, and what I haven't met any grown unschoolers, so maybe I'm just asking in your experience to shed a little bit of light about, you know, I don't want to say what they're like, because that sounds
no, that's so
you know.
it's a great question, right? Our experience is your experience, right? In our 2015, Peter Gray and I published 2 studies in 2015 in the journal Other Education. We researched 75 young adult unschoolers. And one of the reasons why we researched them is because we saw these amazing benefits coming out of the 232 families. And I must say, as good as an experience as I had about unschooling, again, I also teach public school teachers and believe strongly in the public school system. So I'm coming from this research perspective, yes, from experience, but also from a real neutral hat. I'm wondering what's going to happen here. And these 232 families saw so many benefits. I mean, they saw challenges as well, but they saw so many benefits. And so we really wanted to know, like, were they telling the truth, right? Were these families and these parents filling out the survey, were they telling the truth? And so we went out and we recruited 75 unschoolers, young adult unschoolers, to really share with us their stories. And so they went ahead, they shared their stories. They were very, very similar to those families, of course, right? But then there were 3 individuals who did report a negative experience with the unschooling. These 3 individuals had a couple of things in common. The first thing was 2 out of the 3 individuals came from highly religious communities, and 1 or 2 out of the 3 individuals had parents who were diagnosed with severe mental illness. So, you know, some people felt too protected. Some people felt like they didn't get to do the things that others get to do. They missed prom, they missed, you know, the marching band, they missed things that they would have liked in schools. And so are there individuals with a negative experience unschooling? Yes, again, 3 out of 75 as reported by our study. But are there individuals with negative public school experiences? Of course, right? And so again, it's, you know, individuals are going to have negative experiences, and I want to also honor those experiences, right? Nothing is the best path. The best path is the path that you choose, right? The best path is the path that works best for your kid. So that's the best path. Unschooling is not the perfect path, but it sure does have a ton of benefits that I think not only are really, really wonderful for kids and teens, but also should be looked at by public school systems, by charter and private schools as best practice, right? And I like to really turn unschooling upside down by saying that, right? Yes, it's a movement. Yes, it's an educational choice, but there's also parts of the philosophy, like the intrinsic motivation thing, like the non-assessment thing, that would work very, very well in innovation within our public schools as well.
Wow, I take my hats off to anyone that tries to make that cross into mainstream education. I think just personally, I sat there for 10 years and I'm not quite ready to return in any form. But you're right, there are things, and there are people who are working in that area that's saying, look, there are alternatives, there are other ways of doing it. you know, let's have a conversation that says, how can we improve things, you know, across the board. So yeah, hats off to anyone who does that.
Wearing two hats, right? Again, my job, and I love my New York City public school teachers, and I honor the things that they do every day because I know how hard they work to create a really amazing learning environment for their kids. And I also have this research line that I also have personal experience with. And I feel like my job is really to meld the two, to make sure everyone knows about the choices available, but also to make sure people learn from each other, right? We always want to be collaborative and we always want to learn from each other. There's things public schools do really, really well. There's things unschoolers do really, really well. And to have that conversation might be what innovation looks like.
So what for you, because I'd like to maybe not end, but yeah, end on a high note. What for you were the high points of unschooling?
Oh, that's a nice question. You know, looking right now, I'm the parent of an adult. And so looking back, it was literally the best time in my entire life, right? Everyone says that about raising their kids, but I had the honor, right? At the end of my life, I will say that and you're going to put tears in my eyes, that I had the honor of spending that time with my child, that extended time, really getting to know him through thick and thin and whatever life brought our way. And getting to actually know him also as a partner in learning. We still, to this day, work side by side. He was laughing the other day because he was coding his master's thesis research. And he said to me, Mom, I have such treasured memories of you coding with other researchers. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, you know, the gift you give your child is like, he likes coding because he has the memories of me like coding research. But he saw me work, he watched me work. And on the other hand, here he is, this hard worker that is doing similar work right now. So it's been such an honor to be his parent and also learn by his side for such a long period of time. Again, I wouldn't give up that time. It was such a juggly time, but I wouldn't give up that juggling for all the world. It was a beautiful, beautiful thing.
Yeah, I really see that sort of thing coming into its own now that my eldest is actually he's almost 14, but he's 13, and I really see we've moved from definitely me helping him with things and you know, taking a really active, you know, always being there and supportive, but the relationship's changing now, and there's definitely more of a partnership feel. It feels more equal. Maybe that's what I'm thinking. It's starting to just feel more equal, you know. And then so when I'm, you know, the podcast is a perfect example actually. You know, I've recently started doing this and I'm trying to edit videos and audio, and I was, you know, getting a few hiccups and had a few questions, and I didn't really, like I'm going through my own learning process with this, right? And it occurred to me that he loves filming, and he films all the time, and he edits films all the time, and it just occurred to me, well, hang on, I could go and ask him. And you know, I brought him in and he sat here with me and we worked on this project together, and it felt like this equal partnership. You know, he was giving me advice and I was, you know, fiddling around with different settings, and then, you know, it just had a different vibe to it, and it's really special, and it's really unique, I think, maybe, and really you can see how all the years previously have sort of led to that sort of building of relationship, that, you know, making mistakes is okay, and it's okay, and that process of him watching me learning things as well. You know, all my kids are watching me, and they, you know, this isn't the only thing I've learned. You know, I've learned, I took up crochet about 3 years ago, and my children sat and watched me. You know, I was learning, following YouTube videos, and had books, and was learning how to crochet. So that sort of that life learning experience, they get to see you learning as well. So, and there is something special about that, I think, that's really, like you say, it kind of, you know, makes you quite emotional about the relationship that we have with our children. I wondered if there was any books that you would recommend to people, or resources that you would recommend, obviously specifically looking at unschooling, or or very happily theories into educational theories and academic theories into what would help support unschooling parents.
Yeah, sure. So of course, as a researcher, right, I'm always going to say, read the research on it. I mean, unschooling now has quite a bit of research, right, from educators and practitioners. And so it's really important that the research is there. I depended on John Holt when I was unschooling, right, for inspiration. And at the time we were unschooling, Growing Without Schooling was still a magazine. And I remember that magazine being such a breath of fresh air. The writing Wendy Priestness does at Life Learning magazine has been such an amazing source of inspiration. Those were always my two go-tos, right? Like John Holt, Pat Ferenga, and Wendy Priestness. And of course, anything that Peter Gray writes, his blog, Freedom to Learn, his book, Free to Play, right? Like all of those things are such incredible resources for the unschooling parent. And again, I mean, Unschooling, Exploring Learning Beyond the Classroom is a research-based book, but I wrote it for my 24-year-old self who needed to show my parents at the time who we were living with, like, hey, this is a viable option here. Someone from a school of education, has compiled a book on it. And so if you need that kind of proof or that kind of backing, it's a real interesting and academic research-filled book to read.
Yeah, I mean, I love the academic and the research side of unschooling. And as you say, in recent years, there's been an increase in interest and an increase in research. So I'm sort of looking forward personally to more of that, to more people taking that on and writing that up from an academic perspective, because I love that sort of stuff. Yeah, so you mentioned Peter Gray, and I am just going to plug my own podcast, because I've done an interview with Peter Gray. So if people are listening to this and they haven't listened to that one, they can go back and look into the archives and find it. It won't be too far away. So they can go and do that, because as you say, in recent years, he has been influential in self-directed education and research as well, with yourself. So people listening to the podcast can go and listen to that as well. And I am really excited to read your paper, your book in its entirety. So I've had the pleasure of reading excerpts of it. So I'm now really fueled up to read more, which is quite exciting for me.
Thank you. That's very kind.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Gina. It's been really lovely to meet you, and our whole conversation has been really fascinating and encouraging. And I like the realistic element that you've brought to it. I wanted to end on a high note, and we will end up on a high note, but
I think realism is always a high note, right? Like realism is always a high note, because it really is what it looks like, right? And again, there is no perfect option, but unschooling is as close to perfect as you're going to get if you can do it, right? And if it's available to you, if it's an option available to you, or an option that you're interested in.
I think it's really important that people know about the reality, and that we don't paint a false picture. So I'm really grateful that you have been honest with us about that, and honestly shared your experience with us. Thank you for joining us, and listeners can join me again in the next episode, when I'm going to be talking to unschooling parent Esther Jones about unschooling ourselves.
So cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina.